Greetings, everybody. Brian here with another supplemental episode. Today, we're going to be doing something what I think is really cool and interesting. We're going to talk to Kevin. Is it Jardin or Hardin?
It's Jardin, as in
Jardin.
sardine.
Sardine. Okay. French Canadian, right?
Well, Norman.
Norman.
Anyways,
Okay.
yeah.
So we're here talking to Kevin Jardin, who runs the Galaxy Map Twitter account, which is this really awesome project that I stumbled upon recently. That is essentially, like, I guess, trying to make a map of an actual really realistic map of the galaxy and kind of the cartography, for lack of a better term. Is that right, Kevin? Why don't you jump in and give us kind of the 10,000 foot overview of the projects?
Well, I've been working on the Galaxy Map project for about 25 years now. And I actually started it using data from the Hipparchus satellite, which went up in the 1990s. Although it may seem a bit surprising, we actually don't know very much about a detailed map of the Milky Way. And the issue is that it's a very dusty galaxy, and we're in the middle of a bubble, but the bubble is surrounded by a lot of dust. So we can't see very far. When we do use radio or infrared to try to see further, we don't actually know how far away the stuff we're looking at actually is. So until recently, it's been impossible to make a map of the galaxy, and astronomers still don't even agree how many spiral arms there are. So if you have seen images of the Milky Way, they're all artists' impressions, nothing real.
I remember at some point as a kid, I distinctly remember the moment of looking at a picture of quote unquote the Milky Way in a galaxy in a textbook and realizing, wait, that can't actually be our galaxy because we can't take a picture from outside. And I think that was the first moment of like the understanding of we are sitting in the middle of a forest and we can see it, maybe a couple of trees around us, but how do we possibly have a sense of what does the overall forest look like when we can only look at it from this perspective of sitting in the middle of it? And I've always been fascinated by that question ever since. So when I stumbled across your Twitter account and the Gaia mission in general, in the larger context, I was really fascinated by the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, Gaia is the successor to the Hipparchus project. And in both cases, instead of a regular space telescope, they're surveying devices. Just like a surveyor surveys the height of a mountain or the layout of a business, say a construction project, what Gaia and Hipparchus have done is give us parallaxes, which are angles that can be converted into distance measurements. So for the Gaia satellite has actually measured the distances now to about 2 billion stars. And they've mapped out the distance to something about 20,000 light years away.
Wow.
So this is the first time in human history we've actually had a detailed survey that goes out that far. And so astronomers are looking at the data now, and it's a real treasure lode of information about the Milky Way that we've never had before.
Yeah, okay. And so just to be clear, Gaia and Hipparchus before are both space telescopes, there's spacecraft out and Gaia is in the L1 Lagrange point. Is that right? Or
it's in one of the Lagrange points. It might be L2.
So really far out there, much farther out there than say Hubble or the International Space Station, which are all in low Earth orbit, very far out there. And so they're measuring essentially the parallax, which is basically measuring the movement. I was looking at the Wikipedia and it's said something to the effect of the comparison is if we're standing on the surface of Earth looking at the moon, it can detect the motion of a pinhead on the moon, like that ratio of distance versus the size of the movement. Is that right?
Well, it's got a very high resolution. So for example, if there was a quarter on the moon, it could measure the width of the quarter. That's really quite key because what Gaia actually does is it takes a star measurement and then waits for a while and then takes another star measurement. And the angle between the two, just like a surveying instrument, can be used to determine how far away something is.
So you work on the Gaia project itself, is that right? You're as one of the scientists on the project?
Well, I'm a cartographer,
Okay.
and I'm not employed by the European Space Agency,
So
but
this is
I
more
am a
like a personal
volunteer.
project of you taking the public data.
Yes, that's right.
Okay,
I
gotcha.
do work quite closely with the Gaia astronomers, and so they give me data. And since it's data for 2 billion stars, you can't really just try to map it. It would be overwhelming.
Right.
And so what I do is a technique called the marching cubes algorithm, which is up to this point been used for medical imagery. Like, for
Okay.
example, can be used to convert MRI scans into images that surgeons can look at to plan medical work. And so basically what I'm doing is MRI scans of the Milky Way galaxy and
That's
creating
incredible.
images of star density, which at lower levels can show you where star clusters are, for example.
Mhm.
The highest levels can show you where spiral arms are, and there's all kinds of interesting detail in between.
And so talk a little bit about the process of taking the raw data and converting it into some of the amazing maps that are on your Twitter account that are awesome. I saw on your Twitter that you mentioned using Blender, which is a 3D modeling program people use to make 3D special effects. So what is the process of taking the actual raw measurements data that these satellites, that the Gaia satellite is recording, and then the pipeline of that into the final maps that are ending up on your timeline, Twitter timeline?
Well, there are three tools that are crucial to my work as a galactic cartographer, and they're all open source. The first is the Python programming language.
Mhm.
And what I do is I take the raw data from the astronomers and use a lot of graphics libraries to produce 3D meshes and point clouds. I then feed that information into Blender, which can create images. And then I take the Blender output and overlay it using Inkscape, the SVG vector graphics program, so that I can actually produce labeled maps with nice information, titles, legends, labels on different objects, and that sort of thing. So most of my maps up to this point have been fairly traditional top-down kinds of things, but the data is 3D. And so increasingly, I've been looking at virtual reality visualization. And I have a Quest, Oculus Quest headset, and I'm trying to figure out a way to use that to be able to explore the Milky Way in 3D.
I saw that. And so are you teaching yourself essentially how to program virtual reality programs in the process of doing this project?
Well, I'm having to teach myself because this is all very new stuff.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'm using features from WebXR that were just introduced in August. So this is all
Wow.
very cutting edge
Yeah.
stuff, but it's really exciting to see what's possible. And actually, it's kind of interesting that this virtual reality technology has arrived at exactly the same time as the data for mapping the Milky Way. So the two work very well together because we need a way to be able to explore the data in 3D, and VR gives us that possibility.
You're clearly a science fiction fan. You can tell from well, first of all, anybody who engages in a project like this obviously has to have some connection to the science fiction genre. So I'm very fascinated by the idea of world building when it comes to both science fiction and fantasy. And with Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, I always love looking at these incredibly detailed maps of these fictional worlds that Martin or Tolkien have made. And originally being more of a science fiction person than a fantasy person, I've always wanted to have that same sense with a science fiction setting, and I never felt I had. Star Trek is kind of infamous for playing very fast and loose with its geography in terms of, we're going to go from this star system to this star system in the span of a commercial break. It doesn't really matter how long the distance is. And so I'm fascinated by the idea of finally being able to take a real sense of what our galaxy, at least in our local neighborhood, looks like, and applying it to a science fiction setting to the same degree that you can do that for Middle Earth or Westeros or any other kind of fantasy setting. Is that a part of, like, what is your connection to science fiction in general and that sense of things?
Well, I've always been a Star Trek fan. I grew up with Star Trek, and I prefer Star Trek over a lot of other science fiction because Gene Roddenberry's original idea was to give people an optimistic view of the future, because at the time it didn't look very optimistic. I've always been inspired by that. And one of the things that's a bit frustrating about the galactic cartography in Star Trek is that the references are largely to stars that you can see with the eye, or not that further away. So actually, Star Trek takes place on a very small stage. It's basically within the local bubble, maybe 100 parsecs, 200 or 300 light years away. And the galaxy is way bigger than that. And even the Gaia project gives us a map that goes out to about 20,000 light years, or maybe 6,000 or so parsecs. And so what I'm hoping is that detailed maps from Gaia will inspire science fiction to be able to go out a little bit further and talk about other parts of the galaxy that Star Trek and other science fiction doesn't really talk about very much.
And it's just so we have a sense of the scale involved. So you said Gaia goes out to about 20,000 light years at its max. Is that right? And the galaxy,
Yeah.
And the galaxy is how large in diameter, roughly?
The galaxy is about 150,000 light years in diameter, something like that. So, yeah, it's huge. And Gaia can actually see further away than the 20,000 outside the galactic plane. The problem is dust. Right. And Gaia is an optical instrument, so it can detect light way better than we can. But in the end, it's also limited. And so it can't see, for example, much past the galactic center. So there's a lot more that we still need to find out about, but still, it's much bigger than we've ever had before.
Yes. And that's something else I wanted to ask about in terms of the limitations, because this is something else I realized at some point, actually thinking about a science fiction story, is the sense of, okay, well, we're on one side of the galaxy and we know what the basic structure is because we know how gravity works and astrophysics, and we can, have models of that. But do we actually have any sense physically of what is on the other side of the galactic center from us, right? So we've mapped Earth to the sense of, I'm here in California, but whatever is on the other side of the Earth, if it's China, we still know what the shape of China is, right? In that same sense, being here on, we'll call it the left side of the galaxy, do we have any sense of what's on the right side of the galaxy on the other side?
No, not really. We can use radio to detect structures on the other side of the galaxy, but we have no idea how far away they are, and so therefore how big they are. We can't even see everything involving the galactic bulge on our side of the galaxy. So, we're still in the early days of mapping this out.
What has come into clear view the most?
I mean, I think the most interesting thing about mapping the structure is not so much spiral arms, which are really hard to detect even at Gaia's scale, but more like the bubble structure. If you've ever done the old-fashioned thing of using dish detergent and washing dishes in the sink, you can look at all the bubbles, all the shiny iridescent bubbles in the sink. And actually, the galaxy is very much built like that. There's star clusters that create hot gas that expand and press the dust out. And there's bubble after bubble. And we're sitting in the middle of one. But there are other ones that are bigger or more interesting in some ways. And so we're really mapping that structure out. And, we can go as far as mapping 2 or 3 spiral arms, I guess. But the most interesting thing is actually something at the more detailed level, something above star clusters, but below spiral arms. And there's a lot of very interesting places out there that science fiction has barely or not at all mentioned yet.
Like what?
Well, Cygnus X is one good example. It's about 5,000 light years from here. And it's a little bit like a small scale version of what you would see at the center of the galaxy. It's big, it's massive, it's extremely hot. It would be so dangerous that no starship could go anywhere near it without intensive radiation shielding. But it's also a huge star nursery. And it's a place where a lot of stars are being born right now. It would, I would expect to see a lot more written about Cygnus X than actually is. Another place that's a little bit closer is just beyond our local bubble, called the Cepheus flare, which is a huge dust cloud that goes way above the galactic plane. It's a little bit mysterious. What's inside it? Are there stars being born in there? We don't know completely, but it certainly looks like there probably is. Fortunately, at the scale that I'm mapping, the Milky Way is essentially flat.
Okay.
Because there's a lot more distance XY than there is in Z.
Right. So if you go far enough out, obviously the galaxy is essentially a flat disk, right? How tall would you say that the galaxy is?
The thing about mapping stars is that if you map cooler, older stars, they drift randomly from where they were created. And so it's impossible. You get a very unfocused, vague map. Whereas if you map hot stars that are young, you get a much more detailed map. So most of my time is spent mapping hot stars, and they rarely go more than 150 light years, like 50 parsecs away from the galactic plane.
Wow.
So they're pretty flat. On the other hand, if you include star clusters, which are often older, or dust clouds, which are often much bigger, then you do get a more 3D environment, like the local bubble, for example. I hope you'll have a chance at some point to experience that in VR, because then you can see how big it is, and it really feels like you're inside something when you're in the environment of the sun, looking around.
Yeah, and at that point, so essentially the smaller scale you go, or the more local scale you go, the more the third dimension aspect becomes relevant. Is that
exactly? Right? Yeah. Anything local is always 3D.
And then the farther out you go, the more. So if it's only really 150 or 200 light years, top to bottom, compared to, what did you say, 150,000 light years diameter across, that's an extraordinary ratio.
Oh yeah, definitely. Very flat. Right now, the idea is that the Cygnus region, like Cygnus X that I mentioned, is probably part of the of the local arm, and that goes down towards the Veil of Ridge. And the Veil of Ridge is also a very interesting region because it's dust enshrouded, and is also a major source of star formation. And there's an OB association there, which is made up of very hot stars called Vela OB1. If you were living there, you would see a very different environment than we do in the local bubble. And the local bubble is a pretty quiet harbor, away from anything that's very dangerous. In the Vela Ridge, there's giant dust clouds, there's huge hot stars, and it's sort of a more exciting environment for sure. Maybe a bit too exciting for us.
Would the actual environment with the night sky or even the daylight sky look different from the surface of a planet like Earth if we were standing in it?
Oh yeah, if we were in the Vela Ridge, we would see a lot more in the sky. We'd see a lot more clusters. There would be parts of the sky that are completely blocked out because of massive dust clouds. And it would probably be a lot more dangerous place to live because there would be supernova explosions or other things happening. It's definitely a more dynamic place than the local bubble. On the other hand, there are lots of places like the local bubble, even not very far from here, in the Milky Way. So there's probably millions and millions of planets that are just like the Earth. And in terms of size, in terms of chemical makeup, in terms of closeness to their star, probably G or K type stars. So I would be very surprised if there isn't lots of life all over the galaxy. The issue, of course, is how huge the galaxy is and how difficult it is to communicate and even to get around. I mean, for that reason, in my virtual reality application, I'm not really looking at a warp drive sort of thing. I'm looking more at a Stargate sort of thing.
I saw that on your timeline, the picture of the Stargate's wormhole. Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is that you just click on a part of the map and zap, you're transported there into a virtual reality environment, so you can explore that in 3D, and then you can zap on a map and go somewhere else. Because even with a warp drive, it would just take too long to get around to interesting places in the Milky Way.
Even Star Trek's scale of speed, which is A, more worked out than it lots, B, still doesn't really kind of work in the grand scheme of things, and C, is more realistic than, say, something like Star Wars, where there's just no sense of geography whatsoever. If you actually look at the scale that like Mike Okuda and those guys worked out for Star Trek, and then you actually apply it to the real distances as we understand them now, it would take a long time to get from point A to point B with a Starship warp drive, even in the Enterprise.
Well, you can understand why, for example, in Voyager, the crew were very concerned when they ended up in a different quadrant of the Milky Way, because it would take a long time to get anywhere.
Yeah. Well, into that ends, like, so say we did have the Starship Enterprise. Say we woke up tomorrow and the Enterprise was in orbit, and Captain Kirk or Picard or Janeway or whoever invited us on a trip, and we warped out of Earth orbit into the local bubble in a starship going at warp speed. Would it look like, how would it look similar, or how would it look different than the visuals that we've seen in Star Trek and science fiction up to this point, right? Because in a lot of TV shows, we always see these, either a quasar or the Mutara Nebula or whatever. Is there any spot, would it ever actually look like that looking out the window of the Starship Enterprise in real life?
Well, it depends on what kind of visual system you have, because our eyes are very limited, and a lot of the interesting things there is to see in the Milky Way require different frequencies. And so I would assume, as I do in my virtual reality application, that your visual system is augmented with the ability to see in radio and X-ray in hydrogen alpha more sensitively than our own eyes can detect, all that sort of thing. So if you combine all that information, then it would be much easier to see the boundaries of the local bubble, to see all the different star clusters, all the nebula and everything. Yeah, I mean, I would think that the view screen on the Enterprise can probably detect a lot more than the human eye could.
So it would, like the battle at the end of Star Trek II, right, in the Mutara Nebula, where from the cinematic side, they're very clearly going for a submarine battle style of feel of we're inside this structure and we can't see around inside it. But there are no locations like that are so localized and condensed, right, that you could essentially like fly into it, have this crazy dramatic tense battle, and then fly out of it again. Is that
well,
right?
There's plenty of places in the local bubble that you could fly into and fly out again. The density of matter is relatively low. So at the time, you might not even notice that you were doing that. But
Exactly.
I'm assuming that, again, that the visual systems are enhanced.
Yeah.
So you could actually see where the barrier of a dust cloud is or where a Stromgren H2 region starts and stops and stuff like that. But those things are real. They really do exist. And there are ways to visualize them using different frequencies.
So what's the most kind of interesting possibility that you've come across or has occurred to you as part of this project that you've never seen in science fiction or visualized in media, either on screen or in print or wherever, that you'll go, this is cinematic. This would be an amazing thing to see realized, but nobody has done it yet.
There's so many things. The issue is scale, is that Star Trek doesn't really often go outside the local bubble. And if it does, it talks about going to the edge of the galaxy or something very vague, and you don't have any sense of where you are. And my dream is that the Gaia maps will start to become well known, maybe never as well known as a world map, for example, but people will start to know what an OB association is. And if you ask people, where is Cygnus X, they'd be able to find it. And if you ask people where the Puppis Ridge or the Vela Ridge or, all these places are, if we can start to, at least in science fiction and people who are interested in science, start to get a real cartography of the galaxy, part of people's mental framework, personally, I would find that really exciting. And also it gives us a sense of beyond, not only beyond the Earth, but beyond the solar system, that we have a home galaxy. It is our home. And it would really be great if people knew more about it.
I love the fact that this is a project that you are undertaking and putting out there in the world, and that it's got both angles on it, in the terms of it's serving just the real science in terms of we are human beings in the universe and we should know the universe around us, and the material, the potential it gives to telling stories about our place in the universe.
Well, it's an amazing breakthrough in cartography because we haven't actually learned this much about a real place since Columbus reached the New World.
It's a great really example. That big analogy.
Yeah, it's a huge breakthrough. And for the first time, we can map out a huge amount of our home galaxy. And there's so much interesting stuff out there and so much for people to learn.
It reminds me of maps from those times, right? Where, if you were to look at a map from right around the discovery of the New World, or the early exploration of Africa, you can sort of see the shape of, oh, okay, that's Africa, but it's shaped differently because the maps essentially weren't done, or they weren't as accurate as they are today. So you can sort of see the beginning of something there, but from our vantage point, you can see how it's a work in progress.
Yeah, no, we're definitely in a 1492 kind of environment right now. The Gaia is like the first ships that traveled along the coast of the Americas. And we've got reports back, and now we're busy trying to create maps. And they're showing us things that no one ever dreamed of.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. This has been awesome and fascinating and enlightening. Thank you so much for bearing with me in terms of time. You said you were in the Netherlands, right? So there's a great big old time difference between us. So thank you for making that work. And thank you for joining us. This has been wonderful.
Okay, well, hope to give you some updates in a few months.
I would love that. Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much, guys. We will see you out there. Good night.